Welcome, everybody. My name is David Wood, and it's my pleasure to chair London Futurists. Technology, used wisely and selectively, can help humanity to transcend many of the limitations, many of the constraints, many of the annoyances, many of the terrible features that we've inherited from our evolution, from our biology, from previous generations. That vision of technology helping humanity to transcend our limitations is one of the ways of expressing the philosophy of transhumanism. The philosophy of transhumanism and the communities around transhumanism have positively impacted the lives of large numbers of people around the world over many decades, both directly and indirectly. But over more recent times, there is a frustration in some in the transhumanist community that the impact seems to be slowing down, and the word transhumanism doesn't seem to have quite the same momentum and impetus as before. Now, some people say that doesn't matter because transhumanism and its associated philosophies has already done what it needs to do, and others say not at all. The adoption of technological innovations by humans is still at a very early stage, and we absolutely need the wisdom of transhumanist philosophy to guide us in that approach. Now, to help us figure through what the future may hold for transhumanism, to help us consider possible scenarios ahead, who better to guide us than a person who has been involved in transhumanism? No, I shouldn't say involved, has been leading many aspects of transhumanism. Maybe even we can say he has given birth to, that's not quite the right verb. He has fathered transhumanism for multiple decades, and he has been heavily involved in many of the most important transhumanist projects. Max Moore. Max has a fascinating background, spending time in Oxford, as well as in different parts of America. He can tell us more himself about what he's been involved with, but that's enough from me. Welcome, Max. It's our pleasure to have you as our guest today.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here as always.
So what do you see as the most important messages of transhumanism, not in the 1990s or 2000s, but what are the most important messages for transhumanism here and now, 2025, and the next few years?
Well, I just want to, first of all, sort of define transhumanism because we take it for granted, and I'm not sure everybody always has the same concept of it. So just briefly, the way I view transhumanism is really a set of philosophies of life that seek the continuation and acceleration of the evolution of intelligent life beyond its currently human form and human limitations by means of science and technology, guided by life-promoting principles and values. And there are other definitions, such as in the transhumanist fact, which are basically come to much the same thing. I'd like to talk a bit more about that after I answer your question, perhaps, about exactly what kind of thing transhumanism is. I think we need transhumanism a lot today, as much as we ever have, because we need a positive, compelling vision of the future. Just as like when I was growing up, and you might be early to this, David, in a slightly different year, but when I was growing up and my time in England, especially in the 70s and into the 80s, things were pretty gloomy. Everybody was miserable. Everybody was protesting about everything and not really for anything. And I feel like we're kind of like that right now. We had a bit of a time in the 90s where it looked like things were happening. Some of us thought the singularity seemed to be coming close. The stock market was booming. The economy was doing well. We were decoding the genome. And then around 2000, everything kind of fell flat. However, now we are seeing a resurgence in space, in robotics, in artificial intelligence, in a number of areas, not so much in life extension yet. So I think there's the possibility for a more optimistic view to come back. It has to fight a lot of headwinds. There's a lot of other negative thinking going on. There's a lot of people who are still afraid of technologies. And that's why we need a guiding vision, I think. We need to emphasize the positive. And hopefully one thing we can talk about is the sort of the turn to the dark side, as I put it with transhumanism, emphasis on risks to the exclusion of all the benefits, which, everybody else is already doing all the risks. So maybe we can talk some more about that. So I think, people too much doom and gloom. They think we're going to boil the oceans, we're going to run out of resources. There's always something, and always has been that throughout human history. And I think actually we want to work probably with the more general progress movement, which is something that's really been taking off in the last couple of years, especially those of you on Substack will have seen numerous blogs on progress. and there's a new Progress Institute and Progress Studies. I think that's something we should work with, because obviously they don't have the same commitments we do to some radical improvements, but generally should be sympathetic. But they are bringing this idea of abundance and possibility, which I think is very important in today's culture. People are just too doom and gloom. So that's kind of what I think transhumanists should be doing, is really pushing the positive view of the world. Obviously, not while ignoring risks and downsides, but keeping those in perspective. But somebody has to champion the upside, and I think that's what we need to do. And as I say, I think things are trending in a way that might make people more open to that, but there's still a lot of headwinds that we need to push against.
So I'm not sure I've heard about the Progress Institute, and some of our listeners probably don't know much about it. Can you say more about it? Where's it based? What's driving it? And indeed, how might we work more closely with some of their initiatives?
Yeah, it's probably fairly hard to define, but there's a lot of people considering themselves part of the progress movement. Jason Crawford has a blog, and I've talked to him, and he's very much on board with the kinds of views I have as well, although he's not as radical. They actually are organizing educational courses for people with blogs on how to write better blogs, how to do research more effectively. I think that's all really good stuff. And then there are people like Gail Pooley, people from the humanprogress.org, which is a really great website on very positive stuff. So a lot of different groups are coming together to really stand with those who say that the world can be improved, it can get better, there's plenty of opportunities and possibilities, we're not doomed. So we're really part of that broader movement, and I think we can probably gain some new people with our ideas by starting with people who are actually open to the idea of progress and changing things at a more fundamental level. So I would say, start with Jason Crawford's blog, explore around, go to Substack, put in Progress. You'll find a whole bunch of things that are quite new, actually, in just the last couple of years, but a burgeoning area.
Now, you said these initiatives aren't quite as radical as you are. So what's so important about being more radical? Do we need to be more radical? What does that consist of?
We absolutely do, otherwise we're dead. So that's my short answer. Most of these people are, I'm sure, in favor of extending healthy lifespan, but don't talk about radical life extension, don't really talk about aging and death as a real problem. So to me, that's a serious lack, because if you're dead, you're not really going to enjoy much progress. So that's something we have to tackle. And just transhumanists tend to focus on augmentations, right? Improvements, making things better than the human baseline or human possibilities. I think also it's important we emphasize that we're also willing to improve the human condition, in the sense of human suffering is something we want to do away with. And I've thought more about that over the years as time has gone on, because I've personally gone through more episodes of having problems, spine problems and chronic pain and that kind of thing. My wife just had surgery and suffered really horribly from appendicitis. We see a lot of suffering. I'm just reading about Daniel Kahneman and his killing himself at the age of 90 because he didn't want to go into his years of decline, because he'd seen other people going through dementia and horrible downturns. Well, transhumanism, importantly, does focus on expanding human possibilities. It should also be understood that we're talking about revising a human nature that's prone to terrible, terrible suffering, pretty much endless suffering. There's no stop to it other than having to kill yourself. And that is just horrendous. So I think to link to the broader population as well, we need to emphasize that it's also about the relief of suffering, which of course David Pearce has emphasized to a great degree, maybe to the exclusion of certain aspects, but that's really important. It's not just becoming superhuman in a sense, it's also about relieving the misery of the human condition.
And how well are we doing in removing suffering, in extending lifespan and health span, compared to the visions that you and others had in, say, the 1990s? In fact, if the 1990s version of Max Moore could come up to 2025, would he be impressed or would he be disappointed?
Oh, he'd definitely be disappointed, especially, not so much in the area of space, because finally we're seeing that taking off. It's looking very promising. AI, I personally think that the current LLM is going to have certain limits, but it is amazing what they're doing, and it's incredible the rate of progress. So that's certainly very encouraging. But in terms of life extension and healthy life extension, what we've really seen, I argue, is basically zero progress. We haven't extended the maximum human lifespan by a day. Nobody's beat the French woman from the late 90s. She still holds the record, assuming that one is valid. And every day I'm hearing from people, oh, there's a great new treatment, do this, do that, take this substance, do this treatment. And yet, I've been hearing this for 45 years or so, and I'm not actually seeing major results from this. Now, hopefully that's going to change. Hopefully, once we apply AI in an intelligent way to learning about biochemistry and how the body works, hopefully it can find some patterns and solutions that we haven't seen. But I'm not convinced that current AI systems are going to be good at doing that. Not without some additions, I think. They're very good at combining existing information and finding answers, but doing actual real research currently outside maybe some areas maybe of mathematics, they're not really great at that. So, at the age of 61 now, I'm not too optimistic that life extension will arrive in time for me. I'm going to fight for it. I'm going to work really hard to stay alive. I think I've got a good shot at least another 30 years, maybe 40 if I'm really lucky, assuming no further advances. But this is why, I talk about biostasis or cryonics as plan A, because unfortunately, I think the lack of progress means I may well need that. And that's not something I want to do, but that's my backup plan. So I think overall I'd be pretty disappointed, coming from the 90s, especially from the 90s, because that was actually a pretty optimistic time, especially the late 90s, where things seemed to be happening. As one example of what was really disappointing, if you think back to the time when we were decoding the genome, people were very excited saying, oh, this means we're going to have all these new, very powerful drugs that will solve all kinds of problems. And what we actually saw was the number of drugs approved, certainly in the USA, declined over time because of other factors that I think certain singularitarians maybe don't take into account, like regulation and costs and social resistance and bureaucracy and many other factors that are not just on the technological curve. So yeah, the short answer is, the short answer to that long answer is yes, I will be quite disappointed, but excited about space and AI at least.
I remember that when it was announced that the human genome had been decoded or was almost decoded, it wasn't quite finished, there was a transatlantic conference call involving Clinton and Blair, and the two of them were joking, hey, we're all going to be living to 150. But it turned out that progress hasn't happened as they expected, in part because there's more to biology than genes. And genes don't work as individual items. There's not one gene that does one thing. It seems that genes get together with many other genes for multiple purposes, and their impact is in turn mediated by epigenetics and goodness knows what else. So maybe it's not surprising in retrospect, it's going to take longer. So in that case, is it still appropriate for us to have a radical vision, or should we backpedal and no longer be talking about radical futures, but maybe moderate progress?
No, I don't think we should. We need to maintain our position here. After all, transhumanism is not a set of predictions. And this is what point I want to emphasize, because journalists frequently get this wrong. They'll look at someone's predictions, usually Ray Kurzweil's, because he's been the boldest in making them, and they'll say, well, this didn't work out, or that didn't work out, so transhumanism is bunk. That, of course, really fails to understand what transhumanism is, which is why I wanted to start off with the definition. It's a philosophy of life. It's not a set of predictions about the future. Now, obviously, certain general trends we have to have some confidence in, that we actually think science and technology can advance. We can have enough energy for civilization to survive. We can make these radical advances, but we don't have to think it's going to happen in 5 years, 10 years, 50, 100, or 1,000 years in particular. Obviously, we want the main breakthroughs for life extension to come in time for us, otherwise we're not going to enjoy the rest of it. But it's not a set of predictions. And when people like Ray, who does some really great work, and his predictions are probably some of the smartest, and at least he argues quite accurate, a percentage of cases. But that can mislead people into thinking that if a forecast comes out wrong, there's something wrong with transhumanism. There is not. We are the champions of radical progress. That people want to defeat suffering, want to defeat aging, and the inevitability of death. I'm not going to say death itself, because I don't think you can beat death itself, but the inevitability of it through aging. So I think we need to maintain that, because somebody has to push that radical idea. Otherwise, the people who position much more modest ideas will seem like the radicals, the ones who actually want to solve social security problems and retirement problems by having people live longer in good health. They'll become the extremists. So I think we should maintain the more radical view, so that the more moderate advances actually seem more moderate.
Is transhumanism, that word, is that still the right word to describe what we're trying to do?
I don't think words matter that much. It's kind of interesting. Over the years, I've sort of looked at people who've been really successful, and what they look like, or what names they have, or what words they use. And it's not clear that actually makes a whole lot of difference. So people will pick on terms and find reasons not to like them. And I know some people don't like the term transhumanism. I know that, for instance, Ray himself doesn't call himself a transhumanist, even though he clearly is. by the definition of it, to me, he very clearly is, but he doesn't call himself that. And a few other people. And I think, again, that's partly a confusion. I think it's because they confuse transhumanism with certain other specific beliefs. For instance, some people assume that transhumanists must believe in a singularity, which I don't think is correct at all. I think it's singularity in thinking is compatible with transhumanism, but it's not required for it. You don't have to, again, going back to the view of particular predictions, you don't have to have a view of when things will happen or how fast, just sort of a general direction we should be pushing in. So some people think that transhumanists hate their bodies or want to reject their bodies, and therefore they don't like it. Again, another misunderstanding. That's not what transhumanism is about. It's strange to me that people even have this idea that if you want to improve something, you must hate what you already have. It just doesn't make sense. Like if I make a good meal and I think, oh, I should have put some more turmeric in that, it doesn't mean I hate the meal. It just means I want to make it a little bit better next time. So it's a very peculiar assumption. So I think people who say I'm not a transhumanist may be focusing on certain aspects of it which aren't really actually part of the core idea. So I don't think we should abandon the term. I mean, people are free to use whatever term they want, but if you create a new term, it's just going to get, the critics will just attack that one next. So I think we should defend this one. It's like it's a term like rationality that I think is worth preserving, even if it's been sort of distorted in the media.
So going back again to the 1990s, I'm going to feed in a question from Peter Scott. He says that if he transports himself back to the 1990s, he was at that stage predicting prodigious use of nanotechnology by the 2020s. And he, like me, in fact, had read Drexler's Engines of Creation. This is by Eric Drexler. And it was backed up apparently by writers, scientists such as Carl Sagan and Richard Feynman. And they were unambiguous that we would have these nano factories coming soon. But we don't have nanobots transversing in our bloodstream. Is that just a delay? Was it a naive expectation? Are you looking forward to nanotechnology transforming your blood and body?
I am, yes. I think this will happen in some form. I think, again, the problem was predicting a time frame, and it turns out this is a lot more difficult than might have been thought. I think people thought, well, it can't be that hard because we're talking about really tiny things. It's not like having to build, say, a semiconductor factory, which costs billions of dollars and has to be done extremely precisely. Surely these tiny devices will be easy to make. So intuitively, it might feel that way, but in fact, it requires a huge infrastructure and a massive development of tools that we don't currently have. So we can do what Eric Drexler called exploratory engineering. We can take the principles of physics, we can look at possible physical designs, things we can't actually construct today, but things which are physically possible. So I think we can see the general idea does make sense. Whether or not it takes the exact form that Drexler described, this kind of dry nanotechnology of direct positioning, may or may not be the case. But it seems to me the trend will be over the long term, however long it takes, to have increasingly accurate control of matter on an atomic and molecular level. Whether it ever gets to the level of sort of matter programming as we can do with code, I don't know. But I think we'll definitely still get in that direction. But we are making inroads into reading brain waves, tapping into individual neurons and seeing how they fire. We're getting down to smaller and smaller levels. But nanotechnology really is incredibly tiny, and it does take some very sophisticated tools and devices. So I don't think we should give up on the idea, but it's definitely one thing that's been very disappointing given the timeframes we were promised back in the 80s.
Yes, it does seem that there are natural nanobots in a sense, the ribosomes, which are amazingly able to read some code, which is in the RNA, and able to churn out remarkably precise proteins. So there are real-world biological nanobots. There are some Nobel Prizes that have been given out in the meantime for not complete factories at the nanoscale, but at least for tools, and perhaps with AI helping us. AI is already helping us to predict how proteins will fold in 3 dimensions, and it's not hard to see that same AI will be able to suggest ways to assemble nanobots. And when we assemble nanobots, then they themselves, with the right programming, can help us to assemble even more refined nanobots. So it's hard to put a time on it, but the vision still makes sense. It's just turned out to be more complicated, maybe not just for technological reasons, but for economic reasons. Eric Drexler often complains that there were many people who said, hey, I'm doing nanotechnology, give that money to me, when in fact they weren't doing the vision of robots or factories at the nano level. They were more doing nanomaterials, which has been important, but it isn't the same thing.
Mm. Yeah, it's definitely, it became a popular concept that was co-opted to mean fairly boring things like nanomaterials, as you say. So people drop nano in everywhere. We've got nano coatings for your car and all this kind of stuff. It's not obviously the kind of nano we were talking about.
So let's talk about the opposition to transhumanism. And there's a minor industry of people who try to say transhumanism is a flawed philosophy. There's a social movement that tried to say that transhumanism is wrapped up with anti-human tendencies. Do you have any sympathy for any of the criticisms of transhumanism, or do you think it's just misleading or egotistical trends that people are following when they are critical of transhumanists?
Yes, the latter. I think most of the criticism I see doesn't seem good-natured or constructive. It seems pretty vicious in many cases. Smearing transhumanism with guilt by association. Uh, for instance, one reason that I like to clarify, when people say transhumanism was created by Julian Huxley, that really annoys me for a couple of reasons. One is he discussed the idea in some very general terms. He didn't create a philosophy, so he didn't create the idea. But also, I think people want to bring that up constantly because they want to link it to Huxley's interest in eugenics. And that's a good way of, eugenics is one of those poison words that actually is not inherently a bad thing. It just means good genes. But unfortunately, it's got the connotation of central control of what kind of people should exist, which of course is not at all compatible with the principle of morphological freedom. And transhumanists in general tend to be very pro-individual choice about that. So what they're criticizing is actually coercion. It's not the technology itself. So that's one reason I try not to let people get away with saying, oh, Julian Huxley is the main founder of this, because that's an unfortunate association which they deliberately invoke, I think, to attack it. They also tend to mix it up with other ideas or other people. For instance, Joe Allen and those types of people, the guy who works with Steve Bannon from the kind of conservative religious right. He treated me pretty reasonably in his book. He was critical, but actually quoted me accurately at least. And he came over to talk to me for a couple of hours a few months ago, and we got on actually quite well, even though he said he despised my philosophy. We got on personally quite well, but he was relatively fair. But a lot of people from that angle tried to associate transhumanism with the World Economic Forum and Bill Gates putting chips in everybody's brains and controlling everybody. And so that's another sort of scientific view, scientific control over people that certainly I don't resonate with at all. So I think people often kind of, there are things to discuss, right? There are plenty of things to discuss that are actual issues in transhumanism, like how well will we adopt to having indefinite lifespans? What kind of jobs will we have? Will we have jobs? Will life have meaning? These things are definitely worth discussing. Are the downsides to augmenting intelligence? Might that lead to some bad ends? Or if we control our emotions, might we end up just locked in virtual realities that are too tempting and not have real lives? I mean, there are things to discuss, so don't smear transhumanism with things that are actually nothing to do with it. So yes, I think there's a lot of sort of bad-natured criticism. But it's great to have a dialogue. And one thing I complain about quite often at conferences, transhumanist-oriented conferences, is too frequently it's a lot of preaching to the choir and not enough debates. Now, when we did the Extra Institute conferences, and even when I've done alcohol conferences, I like to get people to debate. For instance, at the alcohol 2012 conference, I had a panel on aging research, and I had three different people. I had Aubrey de Grey, Josh Mittledorf, and Michael Rose, all with three very different views of what aging is, and set them on each other. And it was great fun to see that. I think that's much more valuable. So anybody who's organizing a transhumanist conference, it may just put that suggestion in. Have lots of debates, including critics of transhumanism, as long as they're reasonable ones and are actually going to have a real dialogue rather than just be abusive.
So who are the most reasonable, the most thoughtful critics of transhumanism, the ones that can help us to have a deeper understanding?
Oh, well, coming up with individual names on the spot is kind of tricky. Although, I mentioned Joe Allen, and although I differ greatly from his viewpoint in many ways, he actually does a fairly reasonable job, at least in some cases. Like I said, when the treatment of me, fairly reasonable. So it might be worth reading his book. To get the title now, it's kind of a pretty scary, scary title. Other individuals, and specifically, I'm trying to think of. I'm not going to come up with names right now, but anybody who's able to discuss the issues and raise problems, but not crap on the people having these ideas and not just being deliberately misleading and associating with bad ideas. Anybody who does that, I think this should be welcome in discussion.
Where are you with the idea of religious people being transhumanist? Because
Oh,
in
yeah,
the
it's an
early
interesting
days, you were
point.
quite critical of many
Yes.
religious tendencies, but there are friends of transhumanists, or people who describe themselves as transhumanists from various religious traditions now. Do you welcome that diversity?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was just talking about this yesterday with a journalist who's working on a project on the early extropians and how it led to many ideas in the current. And we were talking about this issue, and I was explaining that when I formed my thoughts about transhumanism early on, I was still affected by my background in escaping from religion. When I was a little bit of a strange child, I guess. Between the ages of 10 and 14 or 15, I explored a lot of peculiar ideas, things that you call the occult or the supernatural. Tried dowsing, astral projection, the Rosicrucians. I wrote lessons on the Kabbalah. I did all kinds of things until I realized, as critical thinking developed, that none of this stuff worked. But I think towards the end of that experiential period, I came to believe in sort of a standard Christian view, basically, that there was hell. And when I stopped believing in that, it took actually a few years before I could quiet down that voice in the back of my head that says, what if you're wrong? You're going to burn in hell forever, which is a horrible, evil idea that was invented to control people. It's just a horrible idea. And it's pretty hard to shake that off once you believe in it, even if you don't literally believe it anymore. What if I'm wrong? It's, that's Pascal's wager as well, right? It's a very coercive kind of argument. So that made me pretty hostile to religion. And I was a bit of an arrogant prick, frankly, in my late teens and early 20s. I thought I was a smart guy and loved to argue with people, especially religious people, and tear down their arguments. And I was probably a bit of a dick, frankly. But I mellowed over the years as I realized that religion, there are reasons why people want religion. I hesitate to say need, but want religion. And that's also a reason why they need another worldview, like transhumanism or something like that, which makes sense of the world and gives meaning to life, but which doesn't require any kind of supernatural or irrational elements. So I'm pretty mellow. I think some religions are especially compatible. It's interesting that we have friends in the Mormon community, which is quite interesting because in some ways they're so strict and traditional, but in other ways they essentially think you can get your own planet eventually if you're good enough. So it seems to be somewhat compatible. And then looking, which I've been recently doing for my book on biostasis and cryonics, looking at the statements of religious leaders on life extension in particular, there's actually quite a lot of support, or at least not real opposition, even from like evangelists. I'm quite surprised, actually. But most of the Jewish scholars who've been talked to, even Muslims actually surprised me quite a bit, seem to be actually in principle supportive of radical life extension, which has surprised me a little bit. And that's kind of a pretty core part of transhumanism. So long as religious people aren't trying to take away our possibilities to live longer, which they really shouldn't, because even if I live another 5,000 years, what is that against eternity? I don't think God will get impatient if there's a God waiting there. So I'm much more friendly to religion, but at the same time, I still worry about the irrationality involved in a system that's based on faith and worship. But another reason I'm a little bit mellowed on official religions is I think the problem is not really a religion, it's the way of thinking that's behind religion, and which is not just in religion itself, or not in what's called religion. For instance, I think that Marxism, Leninism is basically a religion. If you look at the way hardcore Marxists look at the teachings of their savior, there is no disputing them, and it's very much something you can't possibly disprove because they'll keep shifting the ground, and it's very much a faith-based system. And I think we see that to some degree in other clinging to certain political views and hostilities to anybody who's not part of that belief system. So I think religious thinking in the sort of the deeper sense is a real problem, but it's not just religion that does that. And some religious people may do it less than some officially non-religious people. So I think it's the dogmatism, the need to have an in-group and an out-group, that kind of thinking, which bothers me more than sort of religion itself.
I've heard it suggested that the relationship between religion and transhumanism might be as follows, that religion is trying to be something which ultimately transhumanism is, that religion is on the way to what transhumanism aspires to, which is indefinite life, ability to create new life, super intelligence, which is a bit like the biblical view of omniscience and so forth. Are you sympathetic to that?
Yeah, I think that's quite reasonable in a sense. It is, it's a view of transcendence, right? Religion has a view of transcendence, but it's based on wishful thinking, basically, whereas transhumanism is based on actual empirical research and evidence and scientific progress and real tools that actually work and have worked so far, so why won't they continue to work? Um, yeah, I think if you think about Ludwig Feuerbach, for instance, he thought about religion and he thought about the concept of God and suggested that what God was really was just humanity writ large. This is a being who is intelligent like us, but is intelligent to the ultimate degree, who is wise like us, but to the ultimate degree, who's good like us, but perfectly wise and good, who's powerful like humans, but extremely powerful. So really, our concept of God, as he saw it, is taking human nature and projecting that outside us and then worshipping this being. Whereas what we should be doing is looking at the qualities we just praised and improving them further, and not looking to an outside being to solve our problems for us. So in that sense, transhumanism does sort of plug that religious place in the brain, which we seem to want plugged some way, but gives us some perspective on the world, makes sense of our lives, and deals with some of these real fundamental issues of transcendence, which can only be tackled actually by grappling with the real world, not a fantasy world.
So I'm going to take a question from Charles Perkins, who asks about the future. Might we be living in virtual worlds, whether that's uploaded or whether it's when we have augmented experiences, where we spend our time with our minds roving around created worlds rather than the physical world? And maybe our bodies won't be so necessary. They may still exist, but they won't be critical to our future. Is that part of a vision that you aspire to, or is it just one of many possibilities?
Well, it's one of many possibilities. In fact, it isn't really one possibility. It's probably multiple possibilities. Again, I don't want to fall into the trap of making predictions and forecasts about exactly how things will work, but it seems like naturally we will develop, at least spend some of our time either in virtual realities or enhanced reality. I actually kind of like the idea of enhanced reality better in general because you're maintaining contact with the physical world, but you're getting a virtual overlay. You can certainly imagine, as was described in some early issues of X-Ray magazine, actually by Sasha Chislenko, he wrote about this, how imagine we had contact lenses that can project information on them, that can take images of people and make them look like whatever you want, medieval characters or dragons or aliens or whatever for fun, or that can show you what's going on in the weather, a lot more detail than what your eyes can tell you. I think it'd be very natural to have that kind of overlay, so that kind of augmented reality. Virtual reality, I'm not quite so keen on. That was well, you probably remember, David, back in the 80s, we had very early VR systems. If you may remember Lawnmower Man, that was kind of the hype for VR back then. That was a long time ago. We haven't made a lot of progress. But obviously, I think the kind of technology we'll have should make that pretty good. And you're seeing some amazing stuff in video games these days, computer-generated video games, which should be applicable to a virtual reality. But I'm a little wary about being completely wrapped up in a virtual reality because then you're not exercising your body if you're doing that all day, which right now we need to do. So until you can be a detached brain, it's not good to ignore your body. And people can get pretty obsessive in these environments. There's a lot of positive feedback in some of these, and that can be quite addictive. And since we are actually still physical beings, you need to watch out for that. But how people actually develop these technologies, probably in some way we haven't even thought of yet. But I imagine some form of virtual or enhanced reality is going to be fairly common in the future. I think what will be interesting is, and I was reading an interesting novel sometime last year, I'm forgetting the title, but it was one of the better kind of detailed descriptions of how a very advanced technology might work in terms of different levels of thinking and different communication protocols with people. So for instance, if everybody's in the virtual reality, you have to have some commonalities, right? You have to have some common standards to better communicate. Otherwise, it's going to be very confusing. You did a very nice job of actually looking at how those protocols might work. How much do you want people to know about you? Do you want someone to be able to look at you and know your whole history, or do you want to be very private? Do you want to have some control over how people perceive you or not? There's a lot of interesting issues that will come up like that. But yes, I think something like that is definitely going to be part of the future. But I'm not going to try and guess at the exact workings because I'll get it wrong.
Well, looking ahead to the future, one attendee who is asking the question anonymously says, isn't there some problematic aspects to living much longer? Assuming we're healthy, isn't the extra lives going to block social mobility? So important new positions will be held by older people. There won't be much of a chance for younger people to come in. There are risks. The attendee suggests that some of this will only be accessible to the rich.
Well, yeah, first of all, that's really several questions, but the one about only the rich will have this. Of course, we hear this all the time, every new technological development, and as most of us will point out, yes, these new technologies often start off expensive, but they come down in price pretty rapidly. In fact, the decline in price seems to be more rapid as time goes on. There are reasons why things could stay expensive, often for regulation or patent protection in the shorter term. But these technologies generally always come down in price. And I would suggest to anybody who doesn't believe that, go to humanprogress.org, which I mentioned earlier, and they look at the time price of various goods and services over time. A time price is a really good way of looking at things because obviously just prices don't tell you anything because of inflation, but even inflation adjusted doesn't tell you a whole lot because what really matters is how long do you have to work to get something. So time prices basically says, look at someone in 1900, how many hours they have to work to have this kind of meal or to buy this kind of automobile or whatever. And you can look at it over time, and what that you can see on that site is practically everything has gotten cheaper and cheaper over time, and people just don't believe this until you actually dig into the numbers. So I don't think that's an issue. It's just a natural thing that the wealthy people will get these first. You can't have everybody get them instantly because that's just not the way things work. It doesn't work that way. So I don't think that's a major problem. We do need to focus on keeping competition open, allowing people to bring new products to market, not allowing anybody to monopolize a market. So I think that's important. I know it was just part of the question. What was the other part that I haven't?
It's a bit about social mobility. If the
Oh, yeah,
people in our 120s are still occupying all the leadership positions, what do
yeah.
the youngsters need to do?
Well, I don't think it will be that way. I think actually in political systems that's more worrying because you already see gerontocracies today, older and older leaders, and because there's no real competition there. I mean, you have in some countries at least elections, but it's not really continuous competition. I think in private enterprises you're not see a big problem here. I mean, right now there are massive, $100 billion companies, $1 trillion companies around. That doesn't stop startups with new people. People at 18, 19, 20 years old competing with these vast tech giants and doing fine, and often being either bought up or becoming large themselves. So I think there'll be plenty of upward mobility as long as we're a growing society, which is why we need to make sure that energy is available and abundant and we don't screw things up with bad energy policy. As long as we have cheap energy, cheap, reliable energy, we can grow and expand, and that opens up new opportunities for people. And we can't even see the opportunities that are going to arise. That's why a lot of these discussions about AI making everybody unemployed, I think is quite premature because what we're finding mostly is it's adding to our capabilities, creating new jobs, which is the way things have always been. So I'm not really too worried about that. But again, asking me to say how things will be 50 years from now is pretty hopeless because so many things will have changed. I think if we get off this planet and we're expanding as a society, we're growing in space, that growing abundance and expanse will open up new opportunities. If we stick on this one planet, especially if we continue growing population at the rate we were, which is now changing, then that might have been an issue, especially if we clamp down on innovation and change. That's the real threat, I think, is clamping down on innovation, change, fear of the future, not allowing things to happen. Then you will see people stuck at the top. Otherwise, I doubt it's going to be a major problem.
So are you cheering Elon Musk on his way to Mars? Are you looking forward to spending time on Mars? Or is your vision more like, I think Eric Drexler had ideas that there would be more space stations rather than us necessarily going to new planets?
Yeah, I'm more with Drexel on that. I'm more of an O'Neill colony kind of guy. I don't. I mean, I would consider Mars, depending on what kind of societies were created there. What I would hope is that, as Robert Zubrin describes, there might be a whole flowering of different kinds of societies on Mars if we get there reliably, and the costs come down, and launch costs are coming down incredibly fast. Thanks to Musk, whatever you think of him in other areas, you should thank him for that. He's dropped costs tenfold and then another tenfold. It's really what's making this possible. If I would go to Mars, I'm not sure. I've been reading a lot about Mars lately. It might be interesting, but I do like the idea of colonies in space better. They're independent. There's basically unlimited space. You can mine the asteroids. And once you're there, of course, it's a lot cheaper to get to Mars if you want to go visit people there. So I'm not sure I'd want to go to Mars, but I'm very, very in favor of reducing launch costs and making this a massive industry. And if you look at Musk's plans, they are pretty remarkable. I mean, he's talking about vast numbers of Starship-sized ships getting 1 million people to Mars. And that seems not like something impossible, but we've seen many impossible things happen when someone's determined enough. So, guys out there, please stop burning Tesla cars and hating Musk. Just, you may dislike some of the things he's doing politically, but this guy is actually doing stuff to create the future.
There's a question from Bessia Vrayat, who is in Turkey, who asks if transhumanists and science can actually be the solution to some of the potential disasters that people worry about. So can transhumanism rebuild part of the environment if the environment's being destroyed by global warming? Or can transhumanism, as you've already suggested, accelerate cleaner energy and help to build back parts of the planet which are in a state of near crisis today?
Well, it's hard to answer that question because I disagree with practically everything that was stated in it. I don't think there is a global warming crisis. I don't think there's an environmental crisis. I think there are local areas where there are problems, and those probably require local fixes. I actually don't regard carbon dioxide as something we should be fining people for. I think it's plant food. I think we've seen much higher levels of carbon dioxide in the past, and we have to whatever extent it's human caused or natural caused, The warming is pretty gradual. We've had warmer before. Nobody ever mentions the benefits of warming, which is interesting, when there clearly are many benefits. More people die from cold than from heat. We see increased fertilization because of higher CO2 levels. That's why people have greenhouses. People seem to forget that. So I don't think it's a crisis. What there is there's a crisis in bad information, in that people are saying things that just aren't true, and they're saying, well, science says this, when actually it doesn't. So anytime you hear someone say, the ocean's going to rise dramatically fast, go and actually read the real research on this, not what the press is saying, not even what the summary for policymakers of the IPCC report says, because that's written by politicians. Go and look at the actual reports, and what you find is consensus that oceans are rising 2 to 3 millimeters a year. That's easily handleable, even if that's continuous, which we can't be sure of. So I kind of dispute the premise of this, but set that aside, because there are real environmental issues. There's people who've done a lot of strip mining in certain countries, understandably, because they have to have a living. Some rainforests that have been damaged. I think, yes, we can clearly do something about that. And sometimes it's fairly simple. It doesn't require actually advanced technology. It can require some simple policies. For instance, a lot of the Amazon that's been cut down is because it's been subsidized by the government. They basically encourage people to do this. By removing those incentives, you can actually slow that down or reverse it. Just as in India, when I was a child, we frequently heard about mass starvation in India, and then it just stopped. And why is that? Well, a lot of it's because they were essentially have price controls on agriculture, so there was no incentive to make food. Very quickly, that solution was put in place. So yeah, I think I don't necessarily agree on which the problems are, but the real problems that do exist, I think we can definitely tackle, and we have. And again, go to humanprogress.org, go to our World in Data, and look up things like pollution levels. People just don't believe me when I say that pollution's gone way down in the United States and most other developed countries. You look at all the major pollutants and particles, and you can see they've gone way down over the decades. And this seems to be a natural tendency that you have basically early on in your country's development. You see this increasing pollution because what you want is more food, more comfortable living, resistance against diseases. You're not really too worried about pollution. But at a certain point, when you're wealthy enough, you start to care about that. It matters to you, and you're willing to pay for it. And so I think inevitably we see a reduction in pollution levels. You can look at the Great Lakes in the USA, which have come back to life. In most areas, there's not a problem. The most tricky things are where we have collective ownership, like in the oceans, problems of overfishing. That's kind of a tricky one because you have a collective action problem, and it's very hard to establish a market, but there are ways of doing that. So I think it's not just the technology here, it's policies that make a big difference. So yes, I think we can do a lot to encourage long-term thinking and stewardship. It's not automatic, and it's not all about technology.
So on the question of policies and innovation in policies, there's a question from James D. What do you think about the network state movement and the idea of maybe charter cities or free economic zones where people can make experiments in terms of the regulatory environment?
I'm a big supporter of the idea. Back in Next to Be magazine, way back in the 80s, early 90s, we talked about this. We talked about ocean colonization early on, and these kind of communities. I'm personally somewhat doubtful about their ability to succeed, but I wish them well. It's very hard to succeed when you're surrounded by governments who are ready to take you over. You can make agreements, like has happened in various nations, but they can then yank those out at any time. So it's difficult while we're on this planet, which is again why I'm so keen on space. It's not just, oh, big rockets, fun. No, it's a whole new environment in which social experimentation can flourish. So I'm very supportive of these ideas, and there are possibilities. Obviously, you can see historically places like Hong Kong, which have done well compared to the countries around them, but they may not last long. So I think these are a great idea, but I think we really need to take this into space as well. But these are kind of a practice run. What would be interesting is actually to have an under ocean. It's kind of my childhood fantasy from watching some of the shows, 10,000 Leagues Under the Sea, whatever it's called. How about actually building something under the ocean as a colony? Because if you can do that, it makes living in space relatively easy. So I really do support these experiments. Social experimentation, I think, should be part of the transhumanist idea, because a core part of improving the human experience is our social environment, our social fabric, and our governing systems. And we're not seeing a whole lot of experimentation along those lines these days. So I think we need to see these small-scale experiments, which hopefully they can upscale as we have more space.
What do you think about other kinds of pollution, such as microplastics, which seem to be getting everywhere? Is that something that might need more attention, or will it be solved by the same kind of general improvements in technology and society that you've spoken about earlier?
Yeah, I don't know how competent I feel to talk about that. It's not something I've looked into enough. I find historically that a lot of things that people say are problematic and causing problems actually generally aren't, but I'm not willing to say that here. I don't really know. Um, I think so long as the lifespan is getting longer, it's a sign that there aren't any major problems. But of course, in the USA, that's not the case. In the last decade, lifespan has stopped getting longer. So I'm not sure how much of a problem that is. There are some strange things like declining fertility levels and apparently declining sperm counts and that kind of thing. It suggests that there may be a real issue. But those things are actually very hard to get the truth objectively. But yeah, I think if we pay attention to these things and understand the causes, then we can do something about that. I am concerned about the fall in fertility, which is happening incredibly fast. I think this is actually the major threat to the future. Well, one of the major threats to the future. Another one is really increasing bureaucratization and anti-innovation. But I think the demographic challenge is a really serious one, and very much so in certain countries, China and Japan in particular, where the population is already falling rapidly. Less so in the US. I think the UK is actually doing relatively well for now compared to some countries. But for many countries, we're facing a real problem, especially with welfare systems, because fewer and fewer people are going to be paying into those. More and more people are going to be taking money out, and that's just not sustainable. And of course, that would be helped a lot by real life extension. But again, we don't know when that's going to happen.
Let's take a question from Chogwu Abdul from Nigeria.
Hey, Chogu.
He asks about a sense of emerging diversity within the body of transhumanism. So we had Professor Stefan Sorgner on an earlier show articulating what he saw as distinctions between original transhumanism and Euro-transhumanism, where Euro-transhumanism is less focused on ideas of perfection, he said, more focused on gradual improvements. Are you happy to see a flourishing of different viewpoints within transhumanism, or do you see some of this as a distraction?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to see people exploring the ideas and taking them in various directions. I think as long as we remember what the core of transhumanism is, it may be that a set of ideas isn't really transhumanism, in which case it should have its own name. And some of the things, from what you just said, sometimes I think there's misconceptions as well. So what people are saying is a new version of transhumanism really isn't. So for instance, you mentioned perfection. Transhumanism has nothing to do with perfection. It's not, if you go back through any of my writings and other people in this movement, you won't find much about perfection. You'll see a lot about improvement and betterment, but not perfection. Perfection is actually an anti-transhumanist idea, or the idea of a state of perfection, because it's a static state. There's no more further improvement. And it's essentially a religious supernatural notion, because it doesn't refer to anything in the real world except abstractions like mathematics and logic. There's no such thing as perfection in the world. And what I consider perfect, like a perfect meal or a perfect afternoon, is not necessarily what you would. So I would strongly reject that idea that perfection is part of the idea. And so if the motivation for a variant is to get rid of perfection, then I think it's kind of misapplied in this case. But overall, yeah, it's great to see different versions and different emphases. Obviously, some people are going to focus more on risks than on possibilities. Just hope it doesn't go too far in that direction, because I think we have gone too far in that direction. I think this over focus on existential risk. It's interesting, Nick Bostrom, who's obviously very much a transhumanist, became kind of very focused on existential risks, and famous for that idea. It's an idea that has legs, catches attention. But his most recent book suggests that, and I've heard him, someone suggest that he may have gone a little too far in the negative direction. So now he's exploring the positive possibilities again. So I would kind of caution against taking too much of a negative view, because then you're not really talking about transhumanism. You're talking about advanced technologies and fear, and that's not transhumanism. It's a tricky issue as to where to draw the boundaries of what's transhumanism versus something different. But yeah, overall, let's explore these ideas, emphasize different things, and see which ones catch on.
Let's talk more about your plan A versus plan B. And many listeners may not be so familiar with the ideas of biostasis or cryopreservation. So what do you see as the potential in the future for more people to adopt the trajectory for biostasis rather than just hoping that they will be the beneficiaries of anti-aging medicines?
Well, so I don't know if everybody knows, but let me just briefly state by biostasis, we're really talking about preventing the deterioration of the human body and brain at the point of legal death. Cryonics being the most common form of biostasis, but not the only one, because biostasis can take the form of chemical preservation or some combination of the two, which is actually an interesting area to explore. So the core idea is to take someone at the point where their body's going to give up, where they're going to point of legal death or clinical death, and preserve them as effectively as possible without damaging the cells, with the idea that technology will continue advancing, and at some point, and we don't know when, it should be possible to repair and revive at least some patients, not necessarily all and not necessarily completely. The way I think of this is I think of it like planning a financial portfolio. To me, biostasis or cryonics is your emergency fund. Right? The first thing you do, if you've got a financial planner, first they're going to say is, well, do you have an emergency fund? Do you have enough money to live on for 6 months or a year if you lose your job? Or if you have a medical emergency. So to me, that's biostasis. That's the first thing you do in your life extension routine. Well, obviously you should be doing things like exercising and diet all the time, but a very, very practical thing to do. You can do today. You don't have to wait for a new drug to be invented, a new treatment. This is here today, and doesn't require that we can actually bring people back today. That's not necessary. We can wait in that unchanging state. So that's your emergency fund, and I really strongly advocate that people look into this. I'm actually coming to the end of writing a book on biostasis, and I hope people will read that and read the full case for it. People are very unaware of the research that's going on and how well we can actually preserve the brain today under reasonable conditions. So I think if you think that we can extend life and live indefinitely at some point, then you should be open to the idea that we can actually preserve the brain today and hopefully fix it up in the future when we can actually reverse the aging process. So it's kind of an underappreciated area. It's interesting as to why it doesn't have more support after half a century. I think it pushes all kinds of buttons even more extremely than the idea of radical life extension does. It makes you confront death, your personal death, and have to do something practical about it, which people don't like doing. They don't even like doing regular estate planning. And I think one big problem with what we're doing is we're too honest. We don't say, well, we guarantee we're going to revive you on, May 2098 or something. We'd probably get a lot more people if we were sort of definite and dogmatic about it. But in fact, what you'll find if you talk to people is they'll say, well, it'll probably work under good conditions, but of course, we can't guarantee you'll be preserved under good conditions. It's possible the technology won't be developed, the organization might be shut down. We'll emphasize all the things that could go wrong because that's being honest, right? It's not a guarantee. But unfortunately, that probably makes it unpopular because people want certainty, and that's not something we can offer.
This is an interesting point because I've been listening recently to a book on how social influencers, media personalities, YouTubers, TikTokers, how they grow large followings. And it's often by being a bit bold and exaggerating their claims, passing on things without really having all the nuances and subtleties that you and I might like to mention. So should we be more bold and less cautious in the claims that we make? In my own slides about what are the skills you need for the future, I've always had, well, we need to have high integrity. If you don't have high integrity, you're going to let people down. I've been tempted sometimes to replace that with we need to be better at bullshitting, better at bullying, but I haven't quite come to that conclusion because I think in the end, reality is going to come and bite us. And if we are exaggerating too much, we'll be caught out. And so I urge that we actually fight against snake oil. We fight against misleading representations. Are you ever tempted to be a little bit faster and looser with the truth?
Well, that's a good question. I think obviously there's a difference between misrepresenting things and presenting them as appealingly as you reasonably can. So I think obviously we need to be good at, as you're saying, at bold, catchy statements, but at the same time not being misleading. And that's a tricky navigation to make. But I do think we need to actually have integrity and be honest, admit that when things are not working or not going the way we want, what the limitations are, because otherwise increasingly we won't be taken seriously. And we were talking about global warming earlier. You can see if you look into this, you'll find that a lot of people who sort of hype up the global warming thing have actually explicitly said we need to exaggerate. We need to actually talk about scenarios which are not realistic, which will scare people into action. So, for instance, the IPCC, most of the writers are still using the 8.5 scenario, which, even though everybody agrees that's totally implausible these days, because it's much more dramatic and you can produce milder effects from doing that, and it scares people more. But it's not plausible, and that's become increasingly people are not taking that seriously increasingly. So I think the same thing would happen with us. We need to be really honest and have integrity. It may be tempting in the short run to drop that. I don't think we should. In the long run, that's not good for us as persons. Being me a virtue-based ethicist rather than utilitarian, that's pretty important to me. And I think it's practically better. So, but that doesn't mean we can't become better at presenting our message and being bold. There are tricky lines as to when do you emphasize the uncertainties and when do you make the bold statement. You can't, I mean, obviously, if you have 30 seconds to speak to someone, you can't go into all the possibilities, ramifications, and limitations. So it's a tricky question, but I'm pretty strongly on the side of integrity and telling the truth and not exaggerating.
So do you think that by the better marketing that might be included in your book on biostasis and by other initiatives inside the biostasis community, that the numbers of people signing up, actually putting money into plans, is going to grow anytime soon? Or might we still be having this discussion in 20 years' time that the number of people signed up for cryonics is still pitiful?
Well, just to go back slightly, because you mentioned the word snake oil. Right now in the life extension movement, I think there are some quite worrying signs of people overselling their products, of the stem cell clinics that can't really back up what they're saying, all kinds of new treatments that people overhype. It seems like there's always a popular thing of the month, right? There's always a new substance that people are excited about. I think we should internally be quite critical of this. If people make drastic claims, we want to see actual published papers and research and have people replicate that and be cautious about these claims. We don't want to have the whole area discredited because of that. Now, in cryonics and biostasis, it's hard to be discredited because we don't get much credit to begin with. So will we become more popular? This is extremely hard to say, David, because I've been expecting this to grow more rapidly for decades now, and it's still crawling along. Tomorrow biostasis in Europe seems to be doing quite well and growing at a relatively good pace so far, but that may just be sort of backed up demand from not having a good European provider in the past. We'll see. It's really hard to see when this could change. Will it take some well-known, respected person? Like it would have been great if the physicist in the wheelchair, Stephen Hawking, if he'd been cryopreserved, which I can't believe that he wasn't. Or the thing I was reading this morning in the Wall Street Journal about the Nobel Prize-winning decision theorist Daniel Kahneman, who basically did assisted suicide at the age of 90. Why did he not do this? Because did he not get the message properly? Did he even know about it? Probably not. Like Werner Vinci didn't get cryopreserved. Why on earth not, given his thinking? It's a very difficult thing to get people to do. As I sometimes say, people often say, "Well, this is like this is snake oil. You're selling something like trying to sell them a bridge." Well, it'd be a lot easier to sell them a bridge over Brooklyn than with cryonics because it's much more complicated. It's much more emotional. It's a lot harder. So this is the worst possible get-rich scheme. And how we could actually get people to do this more, just keep pounding the message. I think at some point it will break through if we present this as a medical procedure. It's an extension of emergency medicine. It's not some kind of really radical thing in basic concept. And keep advancing the research. It's going to be increasingly hard to deny that we can actually preserve brains under certain conditions. There are more and more people doing this. There's, the Brain Preservation Foundation. There's new organizations springing up to do brain preservation research. There's actually a lot of research going on. So I'm hoping some combination of real advances in neuropreservation and messaging will make a difference. One thing I think would be a really good treat would be, since it's pretty hard to revive a mouse that's really cryopreserved right now, one thing we could do, sort of building on the work of my wife, Natasha Biedermore, who did the experiment showing that C. elegans actually retains memory through cryopreservation. Another very interesting experiment that was suggested is you could take an organoid, like a chunk of brain tissue, and train it to do something. And to give you a real example, this actually has been done, train it on a flight simulator. So you can actually train a chunk of brain tissue to fly a flight simulator. What hasn't been done is, what if we then cryopreserved that tissue, rewarmed it? It would have to be enough that you can actually do it fast enough with current techniques, and then get it to display whether it actually retained that skill. That would be a very good proof that you actually retain memories and skills through cryopreservation. Would that make a difference? It's hard to say. People might just poo-poo that too and may not be interested until we've actually brought back a person. I don't know.
Will it help, asks Hamad Simru, will it help if there was a certification, some standardization of some of this, so that not everybody could go out and say, hey, they've got the best solution for cryopreservation, when in fact they were cutting corners, or somebody else might be saying they've got pills and potions that are going to extend your health span. Should we have official certification, or should we leave it to the market to figure out by itself what systems work and what systems don't?
Well, I would say actually a third way. Yes, we should have certification, but yes, we should leave it to the market. So things like consumer reports, for instance, if we had a consumer reports for longevity treatments, that would be great. So I don't think we need official government agencies to do this. And the downside to that is people in the industry can capture those organizations and regulators, and they can then impose their own standards that benefit themselves. So I'd rather see a competitive thing where you actually have, a number of different agencies that exist in various areas. And actually, we're trying to act like that at Biostasis Technologies. That's one of our goals. We're not a provider of biostasis services. We are trying to build response capabilities in various areas and working with organizations to do that. But one of our big goals is actually to set standards for the industry. We don't want to over-control it because you want people to start new organizations, but we want to exclude the people who really are trying to take advantage and just take people's money and not actually do anything. There is one organization, I won't name it, I don't want to get sued, but on the eastern part of the US, which looks fairly dubious to me. The guy may be sincere, but very closed. He won't let you look at your finances until you've actually joined the organization, which is, I think, a dangerous sign. So yeah, we want to be able to have, not necessarily shut those down, but tell people that they're not meeting these standards. The books are not open. They're not investing the funds in a way that's sustainable. I've written a lot about the kinds of things we need for long-term sustainability, and I think we can set standards like that, and that is indeed important in having this taken seriously and eventually becoming part of standard medicine.
You haven't convinced all the audience with your views on climate change.
I'm sure. No, I won't.
Are there scenarios that ought to be considered whereby some of the climate change accelerates so that if it continues at its current pace, then it's less of a concern because surely there will be improvements to clean energy and to cleanup mechanisms. But if it happens to accelerate in the way that AI is accelerated, but this would be an acceleration of negative factors rather than acceleration positive factors. Should it be part of our consideration of the future?
Well, sure, but we have to be careful about this because people are always talking about tipping points and these radical changes because it's a good way of scaring people. And what is the actual evidence for tipping points, in my view, from what I understand of it, and I'm not claiming total expertise, but I've looked into it, they seem generally pretty implausible, especially if you look back into Earth's history and see similar conditions or much more extreme conditions that didn't lead to runaways. There are obviously negative feedback mechanisms, otherwise the planet wouldn't have an atmosphere still. And we've had much higher CO2 levels and so on. So I think those scenarios are pretty implausible, but they're certainly worth looking at. I'm more worried actually about things like pandemics. We actually saw one of those things recently, we might remember, and it was a pretty mild one as they go. It could be a lot worse. I think that's a real risk that's vastly more urgent than climate change that we should be paying more attention to. And the recent COVID experience showed that we did a terrible, terrible job at anticipating and dealing with it. In fact, much of the knowledge that we had was just ignored and forgotten. So that's not a good sign. I think there are other risks like asteroid strikes, which are obviously fairly small per year, but accumulate over time. I don't know whether there's real risks from underground eruptions or whether that's an unnecessary worry. But yeah, these are real things to look at. And I think what we fear most today isn't necessarily the biggest issue. I would also say, by the way, that you shouldn't bug me. I may be a skeptic about the danger of global warming, but don't blame me. I've spent decades and decades pushing for nuclear power. Have you? Nuclear power is the best possible energy source if you're worried about geothermal, if you're worried about global carbon dioxide and warming. So I've been pushing for nuclear power for many years, and I'm very glad to see there's at least a resurgence of interest. Although we're going to need some strong deregulation before it can take off again, because the costs have been driven incredibly high by massive regulation. It could actually be the cheapest energy source and the cleanest energy source if we allowed it to be the case. So, just by doing that, which I think is sensible energy policy, we would solve the problem if you consider that to be a big problem.
On the question of tipping points in climate history, and people do point to 5 mass extinctions in the past, which seem to have happened in relatively short geological periods of time when various things change more quickly. Perhaps triggered by volcanoes, perhaps triggered by other changes in the atmosphere that fed away. And in more recent times, there has been evidence of significant changes in temperature over just 10 years or so when there's been changes in ocean currents. So I think there's an open question here, and we should be monitoring it. But I'm entirely with you that we have to have a high integrity as we're doing this. We shouldn't just say things in order to try and scare people into conclusions. And indeed, we should be focusing on the positive solutions, which include new forms of energy, not just the nuclear fission. Nuclear fusion may not be that far away because of AI can help design nuclear fusion successfully in ways that have been beyond human individual rationality to do that.
I should have a little bit of caution too about being overly confident technologically. Geoengineering is sometimes discussed and is generally unpopular with people who worry about global warming, but some people look to geoengineering to solve problems. That I have nothing against that in principle, but we should be very careful when we're altering a system that affects billions of people, that we've actually got it right. So, and that's kind of a hard thing to do a controlled experiment in. So that's kind of an area where I'd actually urge a little bit of caution in terms of technology and policy.
One more area of possible collaboration, which Chogu Abdul suggests, is the enhanced games. There is a kind of Olympics in which certain kinds of doping, certain kinds of other enhancement is not frowned on or banned, but actually celebrated. And there was a declaration published in December 2024, described as the Olympics on steroids, literally. Is that something that catches your attention? Do you think transhumanists should be competing in such games, or at least celebrating such games?
Yeah, I was interesting because I was talking about the journalist I was talking to yesterday. It reminded me way back when I did some work for Professor Michael Shapiro at USC in the law school there. I think it was my first summer doing my graduate work. And Michael wrote a lot of legal theory on enhancement. And there's a lot of very interesting issues there. So yeah, obviously we have the question, we already had this question actually, coming up in other contexts with, transgender people competing in, transgender men competing in women's sports and so on. We have issues about fairness there. Well, there's issues of fairness, of course, in enhancement. There are already people who have artificial legs who, in some cases, may be actually more capable than people with regular biological legs. There are obviously also existing cases of people doing blood boosting, packing more oxygen in the bloodstream, taking steroids, and obviously more radical augmentations are possible. So what do we do about that? And I think, there isn't really a first principles answer. I think we have to ask, well, what's the purpose of sports? What do we want to get out of sports? Generally, we want to have some sense that there's real competition here, that it's in some sense fair within a reasonable degree. That's why we have weight categories and age categories and so on. So I think personally, it's quite likely, we already have a Special Olympics and a couple of other kinds of Olympics. It's quite likely eventually we'll have an unlimited Olympics. And I suspect most people will probably lose interest in the regular Olympics just because it won't seem as dramatic. It won't be as impressive. But I think there should be a place for people who just don't want certain augmentations. We can't really have, 50 different Olympics with different levels of augmentation. That's not really practical, but I think we could at least break it down into what's considered not major augmentation versus anything goes.
We've been talking about enhancing the body. What about enhancing the mind? Peter Scott suggests one way of enhancing the mind is via brain-computer interfaces, systems that can pick up from our brains without us saying things or without us typing them in. And we might be connected in not too long in the future into communities exchanging thoughts. So there's all kinds of angles in this. Can we expect technology to help us to be smarter so that we're not misled by snake oil or by other trends? And can we have a community intelligence? Is that something to be welcomed, or would you fear loss of the individuality if our thoughts were swimming alongside the thoughts of many other people in our minds?
I know, I'm not really worried about loss of individuality as long as we retain, our own control over our thinking and who we want to communicate with and the protocols. I wouldn't want to. I don't even know what it means really to merge a mind with other people exactly. That seems like it's easy to say that, but what does that actually mean? Does it mean I keep my memories? Are we going to get confused when we think about the past? If I'm thinking of 17 different people's memories, if I'm making a decision, do I have to somehow integrate all these different people's desires? So I'm not sure really what that would mean, but I think we can certainly integrate in a way that enables much deeper communication, including hopefully better emotional communication that humans in general are not very good at, and some of us are particularly poor at, about being able to read other people. You can imagine having an AI system that's built in. You don't even have to talk to it. That could actually give you an idea of what people are thinking and feeling based on their facial expressions or on something else, or an agreed, maybe have biochemical monitoring. They may have agreed to share some of that in certain communities. So I can imagine a much deeper connection with people through that. I do think, though, to make really major improvements in the way human beings think and behave is going to take some very careful modifications to the brain at some point, or additions to the brain, because our brains, it's kind of amazing, really, that we can survive in this technological society with this 3-pound piece of meat that evolved, at least 100,000 years ago in the forest, in the veldt. It's really amazing that it can actually handle this, but it doesn't handle it all that well. It's not very good at making decisions about complicated issues. It's really designed for kind of emotional reactions to survive. One thing I like to mention, it's a reading book by Joseph Ledoux called The Emotional Brain. He talks about how we have all these pathways going from the emotional centers to the cognitive centers. So if we see a threat like a saber-toothed tiger, it's going to incite a certain feeling in us, and it immediately tells us run. And we don't really stop to think about that, which is a good idea, because we wouldn't have made it this far if we did. But that doesn't work too well anymore. The threats are a lot more complex. Just the things we were talking about, you can't just react to them. So I think what we're going to have to do is actually re-engineer the brain, which sounds pretty scary and is scary. Legitimately have to be careful about this. But if we could actually use something like some kind of nanotechnology or biochemical technology to build new pathways in the brain, obviously you'd have to do this in vitro. I mean, in vitro first of all, and modeling. If you could build pathways back from between the emotional centers and the cognitive centers, so that you could actually introspect and actually get a good idea of what you're feeling, because really we don't. We often think we do, but psychologists have shown we actually don't know why we do things half the time. We make up stories after we've done things, so we don't really understand our emotions. We may think, oh, I'm feeling kind of bad, but not have any idea why, so it's hard to fix it. Or why am I feeling anxious? You may not be able to identify that. So we're kind of black boxes. We don't think of it that way. Thanks to Descartes, we seem to think that our brain, ourself, is this transparent thing that we can look through, but it's not at all. It's a kludge. It's a whole bunch of different evolutionary derived mechanisms kind of trying to work together. And the end result is we have pretty poor foresight. We react to things without really thinking very well. We don't have good access to our emotional responses, let alone other people's. So when we talk about radical transhumanism, I think that's a pretty radical area where we'd actually change human behavior in a way that's really hard to do simply through culture. When I was, when I was quite young, as I mentioned earlier, I explored a number of different kind of belief systems. One thing I did was transcendental meditation. I think I was about 12 or 13. My Latin teacher gave a talk on it at school, and two of us actually decided to go and try it. And one thing that the TM people claimed is, and I forget the exact percentages, if they could get 2% or 5% of the world to meditate every day, world peace would happen automatically. Well, afraid not. It's not that easy. Meditation is quite difficult, and it doesn't necessarily produce these enduring changes or immediate changes in cognition. So I think that's kind of the really dramatic area for sometime in the coming decades, is to change the way we think and feel. That's the only way we're really going to make the world look dramatically better, I think.
Changing the brain sounds risky and complicated and might take a while. Isn't it more credible that our digital assistants can step in to help us avoid making mistakes? So we already have some digital assistants. When we get emails that pretend to be from our bank, often the mail system says, beware, this isn't what you think it is. When we're about to mistype a word, sometimes it helps us to get the spelling right. In the future, it might flag up bugs or defects in the claims that a politician is making. The politician said the other thing the other day. So is it credible that we'll have glasses, or maybe my headset will be speaking to me as I'm speaking to you, and it will say, ask this question next. So it won't just be that I've got a screen full of questions over here. There'll be an AI, a ChatGPT, or a new version of Claude or whatever that's coming up with better questions and comments in real time to stop us doing things that end up we'll regretting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I kind of jumped over that to the more sort of radical stuff of the future, but what you're saying absolutely is the path to that. I'll give you a personal example. I tend to have back issues, and I know spending so much time with the computer, you start to lean forward and stretch your neck forward, and that hurts your back. And I'm so frustrated because I know that's bad for me, but how do I remember to do that? I know better, but I don't remember. I get involved in things and so I start shifting, right? If I had a device, it wouldn't even have to be an AI. It could be some like strip around my spine that would give me a little zap whenever I started slumping. That would be great. But yeah, for more sophisticated stuff, like an AI that monitors your conversation. People are already working on this for AIs that can detect depression, for instance, in the way people speak, the pace they speak, the words they use, and so on. That can actually help people to diagnose things like depression or anxiety. So you can certainly imagine a personal AI agent. This doesn't seem at all far off. Whether it's in your glasses or on your phone or one behind the ear, something that monitors you, and you've told it what you want to do. You've told it what kind of person you want to be and what kind of actions you want to take, and you tell it, look, when I start getting unreasonably angry, I want you to tell me. And it'll probably actually try out different, probably do some A/B testing and try out different ways of alerting you to find the one that's most effective, rather than you just shutting it off right away. So I think that's a very promising area for AI to improve. I think the expression of our personalities, at least. The thing I was talking about really is that we're making changes at a more fundamental level where you don't have to struggle with that. But yeah, definitely AI assistance is a promising area.
There's one middle path which Steve Beck the Bus has pointed out in the chat. He says there's evidence that if you have the 40 hertz multimodal signals bathing the brain in some ways, this can help to clear the brain of tau and other problems. It can help us to therefore have better thinking. So this is not quite full intervention with mechanical or biological changes in the brain, but interacting with the electricity in the brain. So neither of us are probably experts in this, but I just thought I'd flag it up as if we are open to new ideas. Hopefully there'll be some more research on that. And in fact, Steve has put a couple of academic publications in the chat, which I will copy into the notes in the recording.
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert on that, but it seems plausible that something like that could work, given the brain is an electromechanical device. It would seem possible to influence the patterns in certain ways. I don't know how accurate we can control that today, but I think with these brain implants we're doing, we already do this for people with uncontrollable shaking and Parkinson's and that kind of thing with deep brain stimulation. It would seem possible we can actually build on that technology to stimulate the brain in very precise ways, not just wear a helmet that kind of forces a certain pattern on the whole brain. So I think that is a promising area.
And Hamad Sumaru has suggested we should all get a cat because the power of a cat can relax us. There may
Or a
be some
dog.
drawbacks to cats as well, or a dog indeed.
Yes. I became a dog fan. I used to have cats, but my wife insisted on getting a dog, and I didn't want to do it because of my bad early experiences, but I'm very glad I did. And yes, dogs can be, if you have a good dog and it's well trained, they can be an enormous stress relief. So yeah, companion animals I think are very important.
Peter Scott says that there is a device that will zap you when you slouch, so that may be on the market already.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to see that because I've tried various kinds of correction devices which are pretty tortuous and don't really seem to work very well.
Mm. Okay. So, Max, any significant regrets over the decades if you had your time again? Are there something you would wish you had done differently? Or maybe things that you're particularly proud of and say, yeah, you're really glad that this happened?
Well, given that you can't change the past, I tend to like Nietzsche's idea of amor fati, love your fate. You can't go back and change things, so regretting it isn't going to do a lot of good. But I can engage in that a little bit. I recently wrote a blog post where I've invented a kind of a time machine that allows me to talk to my 16-year-old self back in 1980. And that was kind of a fun thing. I didn't actually use that much to talk about the things I could have done, like to get rich or improve my personal career. I'm not sure what I would change. I know one thing that in some sense I could say I did wrong, but could I have done differently? I don't know. The thing that I did that was probably not optimal in the sense of the stress it caused me was starting a magazine and an institute with no money. That's not the way you normally do things. Usually, when you start a major nonprofit organization, you have wealthy backers. You have like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, just to take one example. They're all multimillionaires and they help fund that. We started this with Tom and myself, two graduate students with no money. Neither of us came from money. It really is not a good way to do things. And tried to bootstrap that, managed to do 5 conferences and more online, and actually get quite a lot done with nothing. But I wish, and it probably would require I be a different person because I hate asking for money. I'm not good at fundraising. It would probably been better if I could have, talked to wealthy people and actually got decent funding for that. That would be a lot less stressful in my life, and we probably would have advanced faster. But I can't change that, so I don't tend to really have a lot of regrets. Yeah, well, there was one decision point when I was a grad student, which would have led to a quite different life. I'm not sure how different. I mentioned I worked for a law professor, and that showed me actually that the law can be really interesting. I don't think I could be an attorney, but I could have been a law professor, which would have been a nice steady job. Interested in issues, philosophical issues, issues of enhancement, and biostasis rights. There's lots of issues you can discuss. That might have been better because I spent quite a few years living basically in poverty as a student with a PhD, trying to get part-time teaching jobs till I could become a citizen. So that might have been better, but do I regret the way things worked out? No, not really.
Well, in that case, let's ask about the future. And I know you said that transhumanists aren't in the business of making rigorous forecasts, but can you share some of what you expect or hope you'll be doing in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I mentioned the book. So right now, that's my top priority is actually getting this book finished on cryonics or biostasis. It's something I feel like I was born to write in a sense. That I've been involved in cryonics since the mid 1980s. Run the world's leading cryonics organization at the time for almost 10 years. So it's really something I know quite a bit about, and I've been involved with for a long time. It would seem crazy not to write a book. So I'm finally getting to the end stages of that. Figure out whether to get an official publisher or self-publish it. The idea of this book is to be the book, the only book you need to read, because right now there really isn't one. There are journalists who've talked about it from various aspects, usually fairly critical, um, or books that talk about, say, the financial planning aspects, like Rudy Hoffman and Peggy Hoyt's book, which is great, but it's specifically on that. There isn't one book that I could recommend to people. I could say you could read Robert Ettinger's book, but that was written in 1964, the year I was born. It's actually still holds up pretty well, I think, but it's definitely not current. So that's my current goal. And just continue other writing for the Biostasis Technologies blog and my personal blog. But once that book is out and on the way, I actually have another book project which I made a fair bit of progress on a couple of years ago, which is a collection of essays I've written over the last 35 years or so on transhumanist issues with a sort of introduction and commentary from today's point of view. I actually find that quite enjoyable to do, looking at, what did I get right? How have I changed my mind on anything? How have I changed my form of presentation? So hopefully that'll be the second book. And then taking the risky step of looking further ahead, I would hope to have a third book, perhaps involved with the proactionary principle and application of decision making for risks and benefits with a generally positive view of the future. And apart from that, I'm striving, I should say, to stay healthy and not die early. So I'm on the lookout for anything that might actually help with that. I'm not finding a whole lot, but I am a big champion of exercise and diet, which I know are not popular because they take a lot of work, but they're actually still the most effective things you can do today in 2025. So I hope that when you see me again in another 5 or 10 years, I won't have deteriorated too much.
And should we be looking at reaching out to a different audience? Chogwoo suggests we should be targeting children, or at least the forthcoming new generation, because they are experiencing emerging technologies as never before. They're going to be more open to the ideas of transhumanism. So he talks about transhumanism for generation alpha or even for generation beta. Is that something that you would welcome?
Yeah, I'm a little bit careful about that. Some people say we're trying to brainwash the children or something ridiculous, but yeah, I think there are already a few books like that. There's I can't remember the title of it now, but I know sitting on the table at Alcor has been a book on sort of radical life extension for children. It was quite good, I thought. I've seen a couple of efforts like that lately. I think it's quite reasonable to get people, I think putting in a broader frame, though, perhaps in terms of not pushing it like an ideology, but pushing it as how to think effectively about the future. So it should include critical thinking, critical and creative thinking, and questioning assumptions, while introducing people to this kind of thinking. So I think if we tackle it that way, because there's a real lack of critical thinking in the world, we're very bad at teaching that. I have taught that, but it seems to be very uncommon. I think that could work quite well because we're doing the world a favor and the individual a favor by improving the way they think while introducing these ideas. So I'd say yes, but not to push the ideas too hard, but more sort of a way of thinking, encouraging people to think in a more creative and critical way.
So, as often happens, serious discussions about the future turn into discussions about the future of education. What are the skills we should be teaching? What are the content we should be teaching? How can we help people to not be dominated by out-of-date dogma or to focus too much on skills that aren't so critical anymore? You focused on critical thinking, Max. Are there any other skills that you would highlight as a final takeaway for our audience?
Well, yeah, critical thinking definitely it's something that people talk about quite a lot, but don't necessarily practice very often. There's a huge literature on this now, so it's kind of hard to say where to point to. But starting with basic logical fallacies and really looking at that not as a problem for other people, but a problem for yourself as well. I think a lot of people actually look at things like this and go through these lists and say, oh yeah, well, that person is guilty of that fallacy and that person's guilty of that fallacy, rather than thinking about, well, how am I maybe falling prey to these? So that's certainly a good place to start. And and thinking creatively, which is also very hard to teach people, but there are certainly plenty of material on creative thinking techniques, because you can think critically, but the other aspect of that is critically is really about narrowing down possibilities. Creativity is about opening up possibilities, and you can have those two together, but they're very different skills. Neither of them are well taught in school, especially these days. So yeah, if we could actually, if we had the resources to create sort of a series of courses for children or even later levels that taught these skills well in a kind of a transhumanist framework, I think that would be quite exciting.
So I'm sorry to everybody whose questions and chat comments we didn't get round to or didn't deal with fully. There'll be a chance in a short moment after a short break for an informal short discussion to continue, when I'll give people the chance to raise their hands and speak. But for now, I'm going to thank Max very much for giving us a lot to think about in terms of clear thinking about the future, about having a positive vision, a credible positive vision to counteract the doom and gloom and despair, which, if we're not careful, can sweep over all of us. So I share this credible vision that technology can improve our lives, but goodness, it's going to be hard, and we're going to have to join together the best of our ideas, our creative thinking, our critical thinking, to make it happen more reliably. But anyway, Max, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the excellent questions and the exposure to other people's ideas.